In 1902, officials in Hanoi came up with what seemed like a simple solution to the city's rat problem: pay people for every rat tail they turned in. At first it looked like a success. Then living rats started showing up without tails. Before long, officials were hearing even stranger reports. Tails were being brought in from outside the city, and some people were apparently breeding rats just to collect the reward. The campaign meant to wipe out the rats had made them valuable. The story began beneath the streets of Colonial Hanoi. At the start of the 20th century, French authorities were rebuilding the city to display the power and supposed progress of their empire. They constructed government buildings, broad avenues, large villas, water systems, and underground sewers. But those improvements were not shared equally. The French districts received most of the investment, while the majority of Vietnamese residents lived in much denser neighborhoods with fewer public services. The sewers were supposed to make the European quarter cleaner and healthier. Instead, they gave rats a protected network of tunnels with food, shelter, and direct access to homes connected to the system. That would have been unpleasant at any time. In 1902, it was especially alarming. The third plague pandemic was moving through ports and trade routes around the world. Scientists had recently linked plague to infected fleas carried by rats and other animals. Hanoi was also preparing for a major international exposition. The colonial government wanted visitors to see a modern, orderly city. A plague outbreak, or even widespread fear of one, could ruin that image. Officials responded by organizing a large rat hunt. Vietnamese workers were sent underground to kill the animals inside the sewers. The work was cramped, dirty, and dangerous. The tunnels contained waste, poor air, and countless places for rats to disappear. The first reports looked encouraging. During one early week, officials recorded nearly 8,000 rats killed. Soon, the daily totals were reaching several thousand. Then the numbers became hard to believe. One day's report listed more than 15,000 rats. On the campaign's reported peak day, the total rose above 20,000. Those figures sounded impressive, but they raised an obvious question. If workers were killing rats by the tens of thousands, why did the infestation seem to continue? The rat population may have been far larger than officials realized. The animals may also have been reproducing faster than workers could remove them. And because the totals came from administrative reports, the numbers may not have reflected exactly what was happening underground. The workers also had reasons to push back. They were being sent into hazardous tunnels for low pay, while the people who benefited most from the sewer system stayed safely above ground. Records describe disputes over the work and resistance to continuing under the same conditions. The city needed another approach. Officials expanded the campaign by offering members of the public a reward for killing rats. At first, that created a practical problem. Requiring whole carcasses meant municipal offices had to receive and dispose of piles of dead animals. So officials began accepting a rat's tail as proof of death. On paper, the idea made sense. A tail was small, it was easy to count, it was easier to store than an entire carcass. But it proved only that someone had a tail. It did not prove that the rat was dead. People quickly noticed the weakness. A rat could have its tail removed, be released, and continue reproducing. Colonial reports began mentioning living rats without tails in the city. The bounty created an even larger problem. Once the government placed a cash value on rat tails, rats were no longer only pests. They had become a source of income. Officials reported that tails were being brought into Hanoi from other areas. They also received reports of rats being deliberately bred outside the city. The exact size of this trade is unknown, but the incentive was clear. A dead rat could produce one payment. A living rat could produce more rats, and each of those rats could produce another tail. For anyone trying to earn money from the program, eliminating the entire population would end the opportunity. The rising totals that had once looked like proof of success now looked very different. The government was counting exactly what it had agreed to pay for. It was not measuring whether there were actually fewer rats. Eventually, the bounty was reduced or abandoned. But ending the payments did not remove the infestation, and it did not eliminate the threat of plague. Authorities turned to inspections, disinfection, quarantine, isolation, and the destruction of belongings believed to be contaminated. Those measures often fell hardest on Vietnamese residents, many of whom had received far fewer benefits from the city's modernization in the first place. The Great Hanoi Rat Hunt is sometimes told as a funny story about clever residents fooling careless officials. That is part of it. But the joke leaves out the workers sent into dangerous sewers, the unequal structure of the city, and the public health fears behind the campaign. It also misses the central contradiction. The sewers were built as symbols of sanitation, order, and control. Instead, they sheltered the animals officials feared and exposed how little the administration understood the city beneath its streets. The surviving records cannot tell us exactly how many rats were truly killed, how many were bred for payment, or whether the overall population increased. What they do show is that the bounty failed and encouraged behavior that worked against its purpose. Hanoi's officials counted thousands upon thousands of tails. What they needed to know was whether there were fewer rats. That gap between what the system measured and what it was supposed to achieve is why the story still matters. When a reward is tied to the wrong result, people may learn to deliver exactly what the system asks for, even while the real problem remains. If you enjoy discovering true stories from the stranger corners of history, CurioVaultIQ has another one waiting for you.